Have you ever stopped to think about how life can take unexpected turns in the most surprising situations? Well, let me tell you a story that happened in a place where no one expects to find love, a luxury supermarket. It all begins on an ordinary Monday afternoon in one of the city's most prestigious areas. This supermarket was frequented only by the upper class, the kind of place you walk into and immediately sense the luxury in every corner. And there, every Monday, always punctual, a man named Thomas Evans would appear. Thomas was the kind of man who naturally drew attention. Tall, elegant, with a well-trimmed beard and always dressed in impeccable suits. He had a serious demeanor, but the way he carried himself showed that he was used to being the center of attention, even without trying. His car? A sleek black Porsche that seemed like an extension of his refined lifestyle. He always went to the supermarket with the same goal, to buy 3 red roses. Nothing more. It was curious, and of course, the employees knew his routine by now. But there was one in particular, a young woman named Safira, who always watched him from a distance. Safira was 24 years old, had been working at the supermarket for about a year, and despite her simple appearance, with her hair tied back in a ponytail and wearing the standard uniform, she had a striking presence. Safira was different from the other workers there because, although invisible to most of the wealthy customers, she had something in her essence that shone through. A natural curiosity and a dreamy yet skeptical nature when it came to love. Thomas always passed by Safira's checkout lane. She knew he'd come every Monday at the same time. What intrigued Safira the most was why such a sophisticated man always bought the same 3 roses, without variation. Weeks went by, and she continued to quietly nurture that curiosity. Until one Monday, something happened. Thomas arrived as always, with his striking presence, walking straight to the flower section. He picked the 3 reddest and most perfect roses and headed to the checkout. But this time, Safira couldn't hold back. Before she could stop herself, the question slipped from her lips. Are those roses for someone special? Thomas, who always maintained an air of mystery, slowly lifted his gaze, and his eyes met Safira's. The silence that followed was filled with an unexpected tension. Thomas's eyes, a deep shade of blue, revealed something Safira didn't expect: sadness. "They're for someone who will never see them," he replied, with a calmness that sent a shiver down Safira's spine. Those words lingered in the air like a cloud of mystery, and Safira, unsure how to react, just gave a timid smile and finished the transaction. Thomas left with his usual composed posture, but Safira knew something more was going on. The question echoed in her mind: who were those roses for? That night, Safira couldn't sleep well. She found herself replaying Thomas's words, his sad expression. Something stirred inside her. Maybe it was her natural curiosity, or perhaps it was something more. She had always been practical, skeptical about love and perfect stories, but this intrigued her. The week passed slowly until the next Monday. This time, Safira was ready to see him again, and her curiosity was sharper than ever. When the clock hit 2 p.m., there he was, entering the supermarket with the same elegance as always. He followed his usual routine, picked out the roses, went to the checkout, and approached Safira. But this time, she had something on her mind. "Sorry to ask, but who are these roses for?" Her voice came out softer than she expected. Thomas looked at her, surprised by the direct question. He stayed silent for a few seconds before answering. "For my wife," he said, pausing briefly. "Or rather, for who was my wife. She passed away 2 years ago." Safira felt the ground slip from under her feet for a moment. This man, who seemed to have everything in control around him, was carrying a deep pain, a loss he was trying in some way to keep alive with those roses. Safira tried to say something, but the words just wouldn't come out. Thomas continued. "She loved red roses. It was our ritual. Every Monday, I'd bring her 3 roses. It was something simple, but it meant the world to us. And now I keep doing it, even though she's no longer here." That confession changed something inside Safira. She realized that behind all of Thomas's sophistication was a vulnerable man, struggling to keep the memory of someone he loved deeply alive. And that touched her in a way she didn't expect. After that unexpected conversation, where Thomas revealed the story behind the 3 roses, something shifted between them. It wasn't immediate, nor obvious, but Safira felt a different spark every time he walked into the supermarket. Thomas's gaze, once distant and formal, now seemed more attentive, more present. He wasn't just looking at the flowers or the checkout. He was beginning to notice Safira. That same week, something subtle began to happen. Thomas, always in a hurry, started spending more time looking around the store. Sometimes, he picked up an item that wasn't the usual roses, like a box of tea or a random book. Things he clearly didn't buy before. But Safira knew he wasn't really interested in those products. He was creating an excuse, a reason to linger for a few more minutes. And Safira, though still skeptical, began to notice the change. She was always discreet, but one day, she couldn't help herself. Starting a tea collection now? She teased as he approached with a small box in his hands, unable to hide the faint smile on his lips. Thomas chuckled. It wasn't a loud laugh, but a genuine one, the first time he allowed himself to relax in her presence. Maybe. Or maybe I'm just trying to mix up my purchases, he replied with a playful tone, something very different from his usual serious and reserved demeanor. That light-hearted exchange, which started so simply, became a point of connection. And after that, every time he appeared, Safira allowed herself to joke with him more. One time, she grabbed the 3 roses and with a teasing smile said, "Isn't it time to switch to some other flowers? Maybe daisies?" Thomas, who typically maintained a mysterious air, responded, "Daisies are nice, but they don't quite have the same impact, you know?" And he looked at the roses as if they carried a weight only he understood. Safira realized that, while he remained faithful to the rose ritual, he was more open, lighter. Those innocent exchanges of banter began to transform their relationship. What was once a simple weekly routine now became something both of them looked forward to. The following Monday, when Thomas walked into the supermarket, Safira was already behind the counter, ready for another playful interaction. But this time, she noticed something different. He wasn't as impeccable as usual. His tie was slightly crooked, and there was a weariness in his face, as if he were carrying a heavier burden than usual. She hesitated but decided to ask, with more care than usual, "Is everything okay with you today?" Thomas looked at her, and for a brief moment, he let that mask of control and perfection he always wore slip. He sighed deeply before responding, "Just a tough day, I guess. Some days, the memories feel heavier." Safira didn't respond immediately. She felt the pain in his words, and for the first time, she didn't know what to say. That pain, so deep and sincere, echoed in every word he spoke. But instead of pulling away, she decided to do something unexpected. "Sometimes it's good not to carry those memories alone," she said softly, without looking directly at him, as if those words were almost a secret. Thomas remained silent for a moment, absorbing what she said. He had always been the type of man who kept everything to himself, but in that instant, he felt something different. There was a simplicity in Safira's presence, something that didn't demand perfection or control from him. It was as if, for the first time in a long while, he could just be. That week, Thomas returned to the supermarket as usual, but something inside him began to shift. He started to notice Safira in a different light. She wasn't just the young woman at the checkout who asked curious questions and made playful remarks. She was someone who had, somehow, found her way into his mind, someone who made him smile on days he thought he couldn't. Safira, on the other hand, began to realize that the man who once seemed so distant and untouchable was far more human than she had imagined. He had his pains, his weaknesses, and above all, a loneliness she understood all too well. And in that mutual recognition, in those quiet exchanges of vulnerability, something began to grow between them. After a few weeks of these subtle interactions, Thomas did something he had never done before. As he paid for the flowers, he paused before leaving, looked at Safira, and said, "You know, I've realized that your questions and comments have done me more good than you might think. Thank you for that." It was a simple thank you, but Safira felt the impact of those words in an unexpected way. She smiled back, but this time, her smile wasn't just a polite response. It was the smile of someone who understood what he was saying, and what he wasn't saying. That night, Safira went home with a strange feeling in her chest. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. She was starting to care, really care, about this man who walked into her life just once a week. And maybe, just maybe, Thomas was beginning to feel the same. Their connection, which had started so unassumingly, was growing. Slowly, yes. But with the quiet strength of things that don't need to be rushed to be real. After that day, Safira began to see him differently. Every Monday, they exchanged smiles and few words, but there was something unspoken between them. Something that grew slowly, without haste. The following week, when Thomas walked into the supermarket, something was different. There was a softness in his gaze, as if he had finally allowed himself a small moment of lightness amidst his routine. After picking up the same 3 red roses, he approached Safira at the checkout, but this time, he didn't leave right away. He hesitated for a moment, took a deep breath, and with a slightly more relaxed smile, asked, "What do you think about grabbing a coffee after your shift?" Safira was taken aback. She had never imagined he would take such an initiative. For a second, she thought of all the reasons not to accept. They came from completely different worlds. She was a young woman living a simple life, working at a luxury supermarket to support her family. He, on the other hand, seemed to have the world at his feet. But something inside her made her say, "Sure, why not?" When Safira's shift ended, they met at a small nearby cafe, a quiet and discreet place. Thomas seemed more relaxed there, away from the bright lights and the gaze of high society. As the coffee was served, he began to speak. "I know I've told you about my wife," he began, his eyes fixed on the cup in front of him. "But what I didn't tell you is how much it affected me. I lost myself after she passed. It's like everything around me lost its color. It wasn't just her that I lost. I lost the meaning to move forward." Safira listened in silence, feeling the depth of what he was sharing. For the first time, she saw the man behind the elegant facade, and the vulnerability he carried. Then Thomas looked her in the eyes, and with a sincerity that made her heart race, he said, "But somehow, in these small weekly encounters, you've made me see life in color again. I can't explain it, but when I talk to you, it feels like things start to make sense again." Safira was speechless for a moment. She never would have imagined that their brief conversations and playful exchanges in the supermarket had such a profound impact on him. But then she smiled, breaking the silence. "I'm a simple person, Thomas. I live a life very different from yours. I work at this supermarket because it's what I can do to support my mother and my siblings. I don't come from luxury, and I never imagined having a conversation like this with someone like you." Thomas smiled back, but his smile was different now. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. "Safira," he said softly, "it's not where you come from that matters. It's the person you are. You've given me something I thought I'd never feel again. That's worth more than all the luxury in the world." And with those words, the distance between their 2 worlds began to fade, replaced by something far more meaningful. "I think that's exactly why talking to you feels so different. Because you're real, Safira. And maybe that's what I needed, something real." They spent the rest of the afternoon there, talking about life. Safira shared more about her childhood, what it was like growing up with little but finding joy in small things. Thomas, in turn, revealed parts of himself that few people knew, like the pressure of always being in control and how his life of luxury often felt like a gilded prison. The meeting was light, with no expectations or promises, but it was enough to leave Safira with a new feeling, something she couldn't quite define. In the days that followed, Safira found herself thinking about Thomas more than she cared to admit. He was no longer the distant customer who bought roses every Monday. He was Thomas, a man full of scars, trying to find a new path. Then one day, something different happened. Thomas didn't show up at the supermarket. Safira noticed his absence immediately. He had always been so punctual, so constant. That absence bothered her more than she was willing to admit. And when the next week came, and he still didn't appear, Safira could no longer contain her worry. She decided to do something she never imagined she would. That afternoon, Safira went to the cemetery where Thomas had said his wife was buried. Maybe it was strange, maybe she was intruding into a space that wasn't hers, but something inside her pushed her to go there. When Safira arrived at the cemetery, she saw Thomas standing in front of the grave, as always, with 3 red roses in his hands. He looked more peaceful, more at ease than she had imagined. When he noticed her presence, he wasn't surprised, but looked at her with a gentle smile. "I knew you'd come," he said, breaking the silence. "Today is the last time I'm coming here." Safira frowned, confused, but Thomas continued. "I've finally been able to move on. These roses were a promise I made, but now I understand that it's time to let the past rest. She was an important part of my life, but you," he paused, looking deeply into Safira's eyes. "You've shown me that I can move forward, that there's life, and maybe even love, beyond the pain." Safira felt her heart race. Thomas placed the roses on the grave carefully, as if saying a final goodbye, then turned to her, extending his hand. "Let's get out of here," he said with a wider smile. I want to take you somewhere. They left the cemetery, and to Safira's surprise, Thomas took her to the same cafe where they had met for the first time. The cozy, familiar atmosphere helped them both relax, and as they talked, Thomas looked into her eyes with an intensity she hadn't seen before. Safira, from the day we met, something in me began to change. I didn't know what it was at first, but now I do. He took a deep breath. You brought color back into my life. I never thought I'd feel this again, but now I know that I'm ready to move forward, and I want to do it with you. Safira was speechless, but the smile that spread across her face said it all. They shared that moment of connection, knowing that, somehow, their lives were now intertwined. And for the first time, right there in that cafe, they gave in to a passionate kiss. What a moment of happiness for them. And that's how, little by little, life took them down a path neither of them expected. Safira, with her skeptical view of love, and Thomas, with his pain from the past, found something new, something that started subtly but grew through the silence, the shy conversations, and the flowers that carried far more meaning than any words could. What began with 3 simple red roses turned into something greater, something neither Safira nor Thomas could have predicted. Sometimes, love shows up in the most unexpected places, when you least expect it. And for them, it all started in a supermarket, with 3 roses. If you enjoyed this heartfelt story, don't forget to leave your like. And tell me in the comments what you thought about this unexpected encounter between Thomas and Safira. I'd love to hear your opinion. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.